So this is the last message in this Atypical series, and next week we got a really special service. It's going to be really cool, kind of a transition service between this series and the next series, just to kind of give you an idea of what's coming. We're going to be doing a series on fear beginning on the 23rd, so that's going to be a fun series to kind of figure out what we're afraid of and why we're afraid, and maybe how the believers should respond to fear. That's going to be fun. So the idea of what we've been talking about is we want to be an atypical church. The typical church in North America, as we've talked about, is struggling. 80% of churches, Protestant churches in North America are either plateaued or declining. Within our own denomination, the Southern Baptist denomination, out of about 45,000 churches, only about 3,000 of them are considered healthy and growing. So we have a problem. We have an epidemic of church lostness, of church struggles. And so for us, we want to do the things necessary to not be found in that category. Here are some of the characteristics I have on the screen of those churches that I think find themselves in those situations of struggling and declining. And everybody who studies church growth, Tom Rainer, people who are a whole lot smarter than me, will identify with all these same characteristics of churches that are struggling. They're inward focused. It's become, in a lot of ways, the past is just so important to them, and they're so focused on the past that they can't see the future that God has called them to. And the facilities and their methods become their own gods, and they begin to tightly cling to those things and fight for those things as if they themselves are the gospel message itself. They become, some ways, more social than spiritual. They're definitely focused on more me than ministry, more maintenance of what was and what has been than the ministry of what is to come and what God has called us to. So those are the attitudes of the typical church that's struggling. And so we want at Quest to demonstrate atypical attitudes, and we want to develop atypical actions, and then we're going to trust God to deliver atypical results. That's our new vision statement. Looking ahead for us, what does it mean for us to understand that we're going to do something different? Our mission statement that we've identified is that we exist to help lost or broken people become passionate, devoted followers of Jesus, both here and abroad. And so that mission is very real to us. And so that means we're going to do some things differently. We're going to be introducing some new initiatives and some other things that are happening. I've asked you to put on your calendar November the 13th to be here at worship. Be prepared to stay and eat. And then we're going to go into the community. We're going to try to spread the love of Jesus and to let people know that we're here and that we want to be a part of their lives, because we feel like that the message of the gospel is life transforming for them, and we want to bring them hope. So those two dates are very important in the coming days, coming months. Go ahead and put those on your calendar. November the 13th, November the 19th are two most things I wanted to emphasize today. Our main point in this message is this, is that identifying our role in the mission of Jesus will define our future actions. Identifying our role in the mission of Jesus will define our future actions. In other words, for you as an individual, identifying where it is that you fit within the mission of God will define what you do about that. For us as a church, identifying where we fit within the mission of God will define what we do about that. That's what this whole 10-year strategic plan, all this new stuff that we've been laying out for you in this Atypical series is about, is that we've been trying as a leadership team over the last few months to pray through and to seek God and what it is that we are supposed to do in our role in the mission of Jesus. Like how it is that we are to play a role within our community. I was meeting with another local pastor on this past Thursday, and he and I were having lunch, and he's somebody who is leading church that is doing atypical things, that is really reaching people for Jesus and leading people to greater faith and growing in their faith. And so I was interested to hear his passion for the gospel and his passion for our community. And so we were talking about this idea of mission and vision and setting goals and all that kind of stuff. And he asked me, he said, well, what is it you're trying to accomplish? And I laid out our goal for him, that within 10 years, we want to connect 2,600 people to our mission. 2,600 people by 2026. And so next year, that's 100 additional people we want to add to our mission. He said, do you know how many pastors I sit down and I talk to who cannot articulate that? He said, if you come to my church, he said, everybody who's been there more than 4 weeks understands what we are about and what we're trying to accomplish. He said, that's so important for a church to get to that place where we say, this is what we're trying to accomplish together. But for us, that goal is all tied to this mission statement, this idea that we exist to help lost, broken people become passionate, devoted followers of Jesus, both here and abroad. And so we haven't talked a lot about the abroad vision of that for us. And If you're new to Quest Fellowship Church, we have a partnership with Food for the Hungry in Mentawai, Indonesia. That's halfway around the globe, basically, from where we are. It takes about 26 hours of flight time and about a 6-hour ferry ride to get to Mentawai. And so there are villages there that have Christian communities within them. And so it's very rare within the Indonesian culture because Indonesia is the world's most highly populated Muslim country. It is a secular government, but it's predominantly Muslim in its faith. And so there's an open place for people like us to go in and to share the gospel and to encourage those who are active within the local church and try to build up the local church so that they can lead their brothers and sisters and their neighbors and whatever to following Jesus and to really become an evangelistic movement, because in the Indonesian mindset for those who are followers of Jesus, they don't really see a need and a desire to reach out in an evangelistic way. Because their view is that if you're born into a Muslim village, then you're going to be Muslim all your life. And if you're born into a Christian village, then you're going to be Christian. And there's no mixing of the two. And it doesn't even cross their mind that you could convince somebody who grew up in a Muslim family that they could become a follower of Jesus. And so we're trying to change that mindset in those pastors and help them to see a greater vision for the call of the gospel even within their own community. And so for us to partner, we sponsor over 250 children through Food for the Hungry in those villages. We've sent over 4 or 5 teams over to Mentawai to do ministry and to do training, and we're going to send another team in February. So if you're interested in that, that might be something you might want to do, to consider to go with us. I just encourage you to think about that. One of the biggest projects we're going to be doing is probably going to be a construction project. So if you can swing a hammer, this might be the time for you to go. That's our abroad. The reality is that God has called us to something bigger than ourselves. The question is, what are we going to do about it? So this is the last series, and we've kind of, last message in the series, we've been through this journey of the Israelite people from being a people at rest, for being a group of nomads for 40 years who had kind of wandered in the wilderness as tent people, basically just maintaining life, right? Just existing as a people at peace and at rest. And now they're being challenged to cross into the Jordan River, into this land that God has called them to conquer. And we call that the conquest, is what they're being called to do, is to perform and to fulfill God's vision for the conquest. That this is the land that God had promised Abraham, their ancestor, and it was up to them to go through the actions of to fulfilling that occupation of that land. And so in order to do that, there were pagans, ungodly people living in the land that they had to defeat in order to get there. And so they've crossed the Jordan River now, and they're transforming themselves from a people at rest to a people at war. God has challenged all the warriors that had not been circumcised to be circumcised. And so there's a physical act, a physical action to demonstrate their commitment to the mission of God. They've celebrated the Passover together, a reminder of the cost of their freedom and the way in which God has delivered them to this place now to do this thing that he's called them to do. We're going to see something in this passage that might blow your mind, because it blew mine. The reality is that at this moment, right before they're getting ready to go into the original battle, which is the city of Jericho, in Joshua chapter 5, verses 13 through 15, we find this very odd and this very interesting interaction that takes place. And at first glance, when you read it, and then you go on and you read the context before, you read this, and then you read the context after, you're like, okay, what did that have to do with anything? Hopefully we'll have a greater understanding when we leave here today. When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and he looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and he said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" And he said, "No, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped him and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. So let's unpack this a little bit. Number one, we see that Joshua is by Jericho. Why would Joshua, like he's the leader of the people, the leader of this conquest, he knows that Jericho is the first city they have to conquer. It's the city basically that they're camped right beside. It's the city that has closed up its gate, closed up its doors, brought in the children and the goats and the chicken and everybody inside the city gates because they are afraid of what's going to happen because of the Israelites' presence. Because they've heard about God spreading the Red Sea, parting the Red Sea for them to cross into the wilderness to get out of Egypt, and also God stopping the flow of the Jordan River for them to cross over into this land of conquest to camp at Gilgal, which is right beside the city of Jericho. The threat is imminent. Joshua, being the good leader that he is, he's surveying the first battle. He's paying attention to what's taking place. The first test of the vision of the conquest, right? This is the burden of leadership. Like when you're called like to lead a group to do something that's basically insurmountable from a worldly perspective, it's a heavy burden to carry. And Joshua is the man. Joshua is the man. The reality is that Joshua has fought battles before. If you've studied the development of Joshua as a leader, as some of you have with me in the Jericho journey that we've been through, and some of us have studied that. The reality is that Joshua was called to defeat the Amalekites. During the wilderness period, they got attacked, and so there was a defense that needed to take place. And Joshua was commanded by Moses, I want you to gather up an army, and I want you to go into fight. And so as a developing leader, Joshua is given a battle to fight and an army to lead. And this is a developmental process for him. So in this moment, so I want you to understand that this is not Joshua's first battle. And his vision of battle is that he has a sword in his hand, and he's wielding that sword and swinging it and slaying the enemy of God's people. That's his vision of battle. And during that first battle, that initial battle that took place during the wilderness period, you remember the story, some of you, that Moses and Hur are up on the mountain, right? And Aaron are up on the mountain, and Moses is raising his arms. And every time Moses raises his arms, the Israelite army is prevailing. And every time his arms lower, they struggle. And so eventually, Aaron and Hur began to hold up his arms so it maintains that strength. And so it's a reminder that as they worship God, as they pray to God, as they seek God in this, that they have victory. And as they don't, they will fail. Joshua is remembering all that. I'm sure all that is going through his mind as he's standing and he's looking at the city walls and the gates of Jericho and wondering, how is it that we're going to conquer this city that has boarded up and there's no way in? How are we going to do this? The position of a leader. The question for us, I think, this morning, and this is a question that theologians have debated throughout the years, is who is the warrior? Who is this warrior? Who is this warrior? So let's look a little bit at who he is and what he does. Maybe that'll help us understand who he is. Maybe we'll learn something together. First of all, it says that he's standing. Standing is an active position, right? And you know, the thing is, like if somebody's sitting, if they're reclined, that's not a position of action. That's not them getting ready to do something. If somebody walks into the room and you perceive a threat, what are you going to do? You're going to stand up, aren't you, if you're sitting down? Because you need to be ready to take action. If you walk into a room and you're bringing a threat, if you're bringing an attack on somebody, you're not going to walk in and go sit down in the corner, are you? You're going to walk in, you're going to stand up because you want to be up, you want to be ready to move. This is an indication of readiness, that the warrior is standing. He's focused on the mission. He's there for a purpose and a certain intent. See, I think so often, I think in some ways, like we have become, not we as Quest, but we as a Christian culture in America have become so passive in this battle, in this mission that God has called us to. I think in some ways, like we're just sitting back, reclining on our Christian couches. Meanwhile, people are dying without the hope of Jesus, and they're going to hell for all of eternity. I think we're resting in the easiness of what it means for us to know Jesus already, and we're not burdened by the fact that there are people who are really dying without the hope that we have. And we just stand in passivity and allow them to take place. We're sitting, we're reclining. Meanwhile, the warrior is standing, ready to take action. Man, I just pray that we'll get it, that there is no house, no neighborhood or people group who don't deserve the promise of God's love through the sacrifice of Jesus. That you get that. There's no individual, no house, no neighborhood that doesn't deserve the hope of Jesus. That takes action. That can't operate with passivity. I mean, how dare believers even consider that we rest in our eternal security while others are dying to infinite hopelessness? May we be atypical. May we do something more. May we stand and be ready to take action. Key point number 1 is that passivity is not a position of those on mission. Passivity is not a position of those on mission. Quest, we will not be passive. There's too much at stake. There's too many people in our community who are lost, who are broken, who are hurting, who need us, right? Even if they just need us to come alongside them and to hug them and encourage them and love them, let them know that God loves them. Even if it's nothing more, even if they're already followers of Jesus, but they're hurting, and they just need somebody to hug on them, somebody to love them, somebody to let them know that they're not alone. What if it's just that? Isn't that enough? Isn't that enough? What if you go through all this stuff, like all this new vision, new mission, everything, and one person comes to know Jesus? Isn't that enough? Isn't that enough? We've accomplished something. We've joined Jesus on his mission of hope. My firm belief is that if we will truly commit ourselves to the mission that God's called us to, that there's no stopping what God will do through us. And man, what glory he receives in our faithfulness. What glory he receives in our obedience. Amazing. All right, number 2, this warrior has his sword drawn. It's not sheathed. It's not laying on the ground. It's not leaning up against a stone next to him. It's drawn. In other words, he's got it in his hand. Now, there's 2 reasons why a soldier would draw his sword. Number 1, it's to meet a threat in defense. Like, in other words, you're standing, you got your sword is sheathed, and you perceive a threat, so you draw it in defense of the threat that you perceive. That's one reason, right? You're readying for the battle to come. You're anticipating the aggressiveness of the enemy coming at you. Or you're the one that's engaging. You're the one that's bringing the aggression. You're the one that's bringing the offensive. You're the one that's bringing the battle to the enemies. Choosing aggression in order to conquer, in order to complete the mission. Mission demands action. This warrior has come prepared to do battle. He's got his sword drawn. He is ready to do battle. It's not, he's just not coming in a stance of peace. He's coming in a stance of action because there's something that he is about. There's some mission that he's called to. Some of you might remember the story of when much later in this period where the kingdom has been established and then the kingdom gets destroyed and some of the people are allowed to come back to establish and to rebuild the walls of the city of Jerusalem after they've been destroyed, and they come under attack. And so one of the things that they're told to do is that as they're working on the wall, they're to have their tool in one hand and a sword in the other. In other words, they have to always be aware that as they're working for God, there's those who will try to attack us and stop us and keep us from doing that. And they have to be prepared to defend. Right? And so for us as followers of Jesus today in 2016, like, we have to understand that there are always those who will attack us. There are those who don't want the mission of the church to be accomplished in our community. There are those who don't want us to reach that 100 people next year. There are those who don't want us to reach 2,600 people. And so they will work action and take action against our movement, against everything that we're trying to do. We have to be prepared to operate with our sword drawn. And I don't think we need to just act in defense. I think we need to be prepared to take action. Then he asks the question. Joshua asked him the questions. He says, are you for us or against us? Are you for us or are you with our adversaries, in other words? He's assessing the threat. Because you don't come up against a soldier who's standing with his sword drawn, and you're a leader, you're a commander of an army, and you've got a people you're responsible for, and you're getting ready to go into battle to this place, and you encounter this warrior. You might think, well, he's one of them. But I don't recognize him. Maybe he's one of us. I don't know. But maybe I think he sees something else there. Are you for us or are you for our adversaries? The reality is that when we're entering into battle, we need to know who's with us. And we also need to know who's fighting for us. In other words, that's one of the reasons why we instituted this idea of a mission covenant for us as people on mission together. It's the idea that we affirm all the things that we believe as followers of Jesus that we should be doing. And we affirm that together, know that we're going to stand with each other in that. And so everything that's on that mission covenant, and you've got a copy of it in front of you, it's in the pockets in front of you, it's on the seats on the front row, it's out on the table just to the left outside these doors. If you want to understand what our mission covenant is and what our 10-year strategic plan is, that's all laid out for you. If you have any questions, man, come and find me. I'd love to talk to you about it. The reality is that the reason we're asking people to sign that covenant is because we want to know who's with us. Let's stand together in this. You affirm all those things that the covenant says about us as followers of Jesus. Let's do this together. Let's get excited about the things that God's called us to do. Key point in this, the key point number 2, the reality is that if a clear vision of the battle conditions prepares us for success in the mission, we have to understand a clear vision of the conditions to be prepared for success in the mission. We have to know, who's with us, who's against us. We have to know. In other words, sometimes when you're operating on mission for God, there are people who will come against you, and sometimes they come against you from within. Sometimes they do. They just do. That's just the way it works, and sometimes that's difficult. Sometimes people will come at you in passivity, and sometimes people will be aggressive. I told you about my friend Nathan, this young pastor that I'm trying to help and trying to coach, and somebody in his church, because he is instituting some change within his church, and somebody within his church had started a Facebook page that says, the title of the Facebook page was Evict Nathan Brooks. He was inviting everybody into the church, to become friends with him on this Facebook page, whoever this person was. And he's never known who it is, right? So it's somebody within the church who's being passively aggressive against what he's trying to do in leadership for the church. That's the worst. If you're against what we're doing, I'd love to just talk to you about it, man. I'd just love to have the conversations because we can lovingly disagree, and that's okay. The worst part is we disagree and we build division. That's not healthy. We want everybody to get excited about the things that God has called us to because we really believe that our community will be transformed, that lives will be changed if we're committed to this together. We really believe that. And that's the only reason we're willing to do it. Right? It would have been much easier for us to never have mentioned any of this. It would have been much easier for us as a leadership group to just let things go as they were. To just be at rest. It would have been much easier for the Israelites if they had just stayed in the wilderness period. God was feeding them every day with the manna from heaven, man. They had it made. They weren't at war. Nobody was attacking them, and it was okay. That was the easy thing to do, but God had called them to a mission. God has called us to a mission. Something far beyond being at rest and taking it easy. A clear vision of the battle conditions prepares us for success in the mission. Very clear. The warrior says this, right? Joshua says to him, are you for us or are you for our adversaries? And he says no. I love that answer. That's awesome. It's almost like sometimes we operate with these absolutes within our own brain. So that's the question. Is Joshua operating with these absolutes that you either have to be for us or you have to be against us because that's his world? And he's not really seeing beyond that at the moment. And sometimes we put people in those same situations, don't we? I remember when I was a kid, like when I was growing up in North Carolina, I was born in 1968. So I was a young kid in the early 70s, right? You meet a kid on the playground in the early 70s in North Carolina, you ask them a question, are you state or Carolina? And that determined whether or not you could play with that kid. Every once in a while, you get somebody to say Duke or Wake Forest. Every once in a while, but very rarely. Those were the kids that you had just to determine how nerdy are they, and you might or might not could play with those kids. It just depended on what they had to bring to the table to the friendship, right? But Duke, like, I'm an NC State fan, and I'm an NC State grad. And at that point, I was a huge NC State fan. I had the tube socks, that came up with the red stripes and the wolf on the side. I had it all. I'm just telling you. I was all in. So if I met a kid who was a Carolina fan, I didn't even talk to him. I would shake my head in disgust, and I would shun them for the rest of recess. Right? Because that was my reality. That was what I was operating within. And for me, there was only two answers to that. It was either you were a good person or you were a bad person. You were good or you were evil. And I'm just telling you right now, I still do that when I meet you. State or Carolina. Mike Krzyzewski had not even set foot on the campus at Duke at that point, so they were nothing at that point. See, Joshua's operating under his reality that it's either us or the people of Jericho. And this warrior is saying that there's something bigger taking place here than just that. No. So what is he really communicating when he says no to this? It kind of brings back, like when I read that answer, it kind of takes me back to that moment where when Moses is dealing with God and God's trying to convince Moses to go back and lead the people out. And he says, well, when I go back and I tell him who sent him and who should I say? And God says, just tell him I am. What? Just tell them I am. Just tell them the great I am, the I am sent you. Just tell them I am sent you. And then later you fast forward into Jesus' ministry, and hundreds of thousands of years later, Jesus is there, right? He's working with the Pharisees, and like they're debating him, and they're talking about their father Abraham, and they're going back to the covenant of Abraham. And then Jesus says to them, well, before Abraham was, I am. Bam, connected it all together. Before Abraham was, I am. That doesn't even make grammatical sense. It makes perfect sense if you understand the eternal nature of God, who operates above all things that we see and we experience. And in this moment, are you for us or are you against us? No. I think it's all connected. I think it all makes sense. What's being communicated is that there's something bigger going on here. Then he says, I'm the commander of the Lord's army. I'm commander of the army of the Lord. So what does that mean? That means he holds the position of highest authority that there is. He's above all other warriors, both physical and spiritual, if he's the commander of the army of the Lord. And I think in this moment that this warrior is standing here as a physical reminder of a spiritual battle that's taking place, a spiritual reality that so often we lose sight of. We get so caught up in our needs and our wants and the things that happen in our life and the problems that we have paying our bills, or we got car trouble, or we got trees down, or whatever it might be. We get so caught up in all of that that we miss the spiritual reality that's operating around us all the time. Key point number 3 is that sometimes we need a physical reminder of the spiritual reality. Sometimes we need a physical reminder of the spiritual reality. Sometimes God needs to shake us up a little bit to help us to realize what's really taking place, that there's a bigger battle that's being waged all the time around us. Like right now, there are warriors waging war above us and around us that we can't even see. The armies of Satan and the armies of God going at each other. I was at a meeting not too long ago. I lose sight. I'm so busy these days. I don't know if it was I think it was this past Tuesday. I was at a breakfast meeting. The town of Garner was hosting along with the Garner Police Department and the Garner Chamber of Commerce and First Baptist Church of Garner, was hosting a breakfast meeting along with the community on the idea, on the topic of race relations and the struggles that's been going on between police, African-American community, and all those kinds of things. And there was one African-American pastor there who stood up. And he said, here's the thing we need to remember. We need to figure this out. Who's the enemy? He said, for all my brothers and sisters in the room who are like me, who look like me, the enemy's not the white man. For all the white people in the room, the enemy's not the black man. The enemy that we all face is Satan. And he's out to destroy us. And he wants us to hate each other. And right now he's winning. And the only way we stop it is with love, by loving each other. Yeah, you could have heard like a pin drop in that room. Because I'm sure there's spiritual and non-spiritual people in that room. There's believers and non-believers in that room. Because I know some of them. But he's right. Like, this goes back to the idea that when Joshua asked him questions, are you for us or against us, identifying who's with you, understand who the real enemy is, people. That's what we're fighting. And so that's a battle that we alone physically cannot win. The greatest weapon that we have in a spiritual battle is for us to get on our knees and pray to God. When we're on our knees praying, that's the same as a warrior of God standing, wielding his sword or her sword. When we're on our knees praying, that's the strongest that we'll ever be. Knowing that God's going to be the one to deliver. Sometimes we need a physical reminder of a spiritual reality. Then he says, I have come, right? I am. I have come. In other words, I'm here. There's something bigger taking place. This is action. This is initiative. The mission of God matters. This thing takes place, not just out of some isolation that God's not paying attention to. God is involved in this. God's paying attention. And that this whole mission basically points to what God is up to through Jesus Christ in the long run. And then Joshua bows down and he worships. I think there's a recognition of who he's talking to. There's power and authority coming from the voice of this warrior. And in the face of holiness, we are all humbled. This is key point number 4, is that getting a glimpse of the holiness of God brings us to our knees. Like, if you've never been in that point where you just really know, you've experienced and you've identified and you see the true holiness of God. And in that moment, recognize your own sin. That should bring you to your knees. Joshua worships. And then the warrior says, take off your sandals. You're standing on holy ground. An indication of who this warrior might be. I believe that this warrior is Jesus, and there's some debate about that, but I believe there's some good evidence to point to this. This is what we call a Christophany. Like you see Christ in the Old Testament, the physical representation of Christ. He has the role of highest authority. Only Jesus holds that role. Jesus sits at the right hand of the Father, right? He says to them that this is, to Joshua, this is holy ground. And so the only way a ground can become holy is if one who is standing on it is holy. And the only people we know are holy are God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And he receives the worship of Joshua. He doesn't rebuke Joshua for worshiping him. He doesn't say, I'm not worthy of your worship. If he was an angel, if he was one of the angels who are in God's army, he would not have received his worship. But he receives the worship. He almost encourages it. Plus the fact that the conquest points to the new covenant. This idea of somebody leading us from a wilderness period into a land of promise and hope and prosperity. Jesus takes us from our spiritual wilderness and leads us to a spiritual hope and a spiritual prosperity. In other words, the conquest matters to Jesus because ultimately it was a conquest that would develop a kingdom, and from the kingdom would come the eternal king. It's all connected to the mission of Jesus. It's all connected to the new covenant. Forgot a key point. Key point number 5 is that we march in step with the biblical expectations of God's people. But it's Jesus who's waging a war in the hearts of the people that we're called to reach. That's not our battle. That's the battle for Jesus. It's our responsibility to be obedient. So let me summarize the key points quickly, as I'm already out of time, is that passivity is not the position of those on mission. Number one, passivity is not the position of those on mission. We cannot afford to be passive. A clear vision, number two, a clear vision of the battle conditions prepares us for success on the mission. We have to understand the lay of the land, and hopefully we do. We've identified that's how we've shaped our vision and our mission and the new initiatives, because we've got a clear understanding of what's going on in our community. Number three is that sometimes we need a physical reminder of the spiritual reality. Number four is that getting a glimpse of the holiness of God brings us to our knees. Key point number five is that we march in step with the biblical expectations of the people of God, but it's Jesus who's waging war in the hearts of the people that we're called to reach. Just to remind you, the main point I want you to walk away with today is that identifying our role in the mission of Jesus will define our future actions. Here's what we need to think about. If you've been coming for a while and you kind of heard this vision laid out before you a couple different times, and you've been praying about whether or not it's for you, then I encourage you to sign that covenant today and just become part of what God's doing through Quest Fellowship. If you've got some questions about it, I'd love for you to come and talk to me or come and talk to one of the staff or one of the elders about that. I ask our elders if they'll just kind of hang out by these doors over here. Also, if you haven't taken the Samaritan's Purse Operation Christmas Child shoebox, take one of those or two of those or 10 of those or 30 of those on your way out the door and bring those back. We're collecting those through the end of this month, so make sure you do that. But here's what I want you to really think about. What is your role, your individual role in us accomplishing the mission that God has called us to? And what are you going to do about it? What do you know God's calling you to do? Some of you have been talking to me about being baptized. That's something you just never done, and you understand that that's part of the covenant as a believer's baptism, and so you want to take that next step, and I just encourage you to be bold in that, to be courageous. I've already got, I think, 4 people who are agreed to do that. On November the 6th is when we're doing our baptism service, so I just encourage you to think about that. If you're a student in the room, we've got student baptism on the 30th. If you want to be a part of that, it's an awesome time to celebrate together with your friends and your family what God's doing in your life. Just encourage you to talk to Pastor Ray about that, or come and find me, and I'll direct you to the great bald one. That's what we call Ray. I want you to stand. We're going to pray today for us to respond in appropriate ways in which God has called us to respond. Let me pray for us. Father, we don't come before you lightly. We come understanding your holiness, and so we come begging your forgiveness, number one. Knowing that we need to come as your people in repentance before you, understanding, Father, that it's only through the blood of Jesus Christ on the cross that we can be healed and that we can have hope, and that, Father, we come into relationship with you through that. Father, we know it wasn't because of ritual that Jesus went to the cross. It was because of relationship. It was because of your love for us, and your desire for us to be in a relationship and operate fully in relationship with you. So we come today experiencing that and celebrating that. So, Father, I pray that you're challenging us individually today as you've challenged us corporately to get on mission for you, to be obedient to that calling. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.